Hello, and welcome to On Point. I'm Scott Sanders. When Americans think of terrorists, we often think of foreigners, and often of people from countries where Islam is practiced. These thoughts can sometimes lead to a fear of Islam or Islamophobia. But what most Americans don't realize is that it's actually American citizens who commit most terror attacks. Sandy Hook, the Orlando nightclub, San Bernardino, the Charleston Church, all were carried out by American citizens or permanent U.S. residents. Between 2001 and 2015, there were 182 non-jihadist perpetrators of terror attacks in the U.S. Of those 182, 165 were white. President Obama advocated for a more nuanced approach to fighting terrorism.
Rather than offer false promises that we can eliminate terrorism by dropping more bombs or deploying more and more troops, or fencing ourselves off from the rest of the world, we have to take a long view of the terrorist threat, and we have to pursue a smart strategy that can be sustained.
President-elect Trump has announced a plan to ban Muslim immigration to the U.S. But with so many attacks carried out by Americans, many are wondering if Trump's focus should be on threats from home soil. On Point's Chidbachian has more on the story.
Thank you, Scott. Joining me today is Dr. Erroll from USC's Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies, and Edina Lekovic, a consultant from the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Thank you both for being here today. So my first question is, what is terrorism in your eyes?
Terrorism, to me, has to have three vital components. It has to have a threat or an act of violence. It has to have some legitimizing ideology it's attached to, and it's got to have also a civilian, most likely a victim. There's got to be some political driver to it. So, in my opinion, Dylan Roof checks all the boxes for the definition of a terrorist.
Okay. Now, Edina?
I think the professor's got it all right. Terrorism is a politically motivated act of violence directed towards civilians. And the way that terrorism is applied in our society by law enforcement and let alone in the court of public opinion is much looser than, actually much tighter than that, I should say. When we use the word terrorist far too often, it's a code word for solely that of Muslim perpetrators of so-called terrorism. And so I think that it's really important to go back to the definition so that when we talk about terrorism, that we know that we're talking about all forms of politically motivated violence that take civilian lives instead of having a misunderstanding of what it is that terrorism is about.
So let's talk about Dylan Roof. What do you have to say about that?
I'm always challenged by the term hate crime. You know, Dylan Roof is being prosecuted for hate crime. He's not being prosecuted for domestic terrorism. And that's concerning to people like me. I'm working with a group called Life After Hate. You know who they are? And one of the individuals there is a former skinhead, former neo-Nazi, and we are going to actively push for domestic terrorism to be applied in more of these cases. It's unnerving that when we have an incident that occurred just about a month or two ago, where an individual who planted some improvised explosive devices in New Jersey and New York and blew up a trash can, and fortunately no one was killed or injured. He is at this point being looked at as being prosecuted for terrorism. And Dylan Roof, who sat in the church for an hour and thought about this and gave everybody all the reasons that he did it, is being prosecuted for a hate crime. And I just don't understand that.
Why do you think that is, though? It's really interesting.
It is. I mean, you've got an individual who engaged in violence, killed civilians, had a clear political motivation that he stated and articulated and had written about. He seems to check all the boxes for terrorism to me, and yet he's being prosecuted for hate crime.
I think that this is one of the most vivid examples of our day of the ridiculous double standard, and how that double standard doesn't serve us. It doesn't serve the Constitution. It doesn't serve the American public, and it doesn't it doesn't make any of us safer. And it also, in a perverse way, sends a signal to the future Dylan Roofs, those who would be inspired or who think he did a good thing, and to see, well, I'm not going to face domestic terrorism charges. I may not face the death penalty or even a life sentence. Who knows, right? Now, if you are a young American Muslim, or and you were a person who, let's say, worst case scenario, has some immigration violation, and then ends up getting coerced into becoming an undercover informant, and then or is lured in by somebody else who is using language that supports violent extremism, right? And they are stupid enough or whatever, and or to follow along with it. That person, and there's a case in New York, and the Newburgh sting is what it was called. These were 4 young African American men who were impoverished, uneducated, and they were manipulated by an undercover informant who lured them with money and the promise of a better life, and they had no intention of going through with it. There was a HBO documentary about this. It's called The Newburgh Sting. These 4 guys ended up getting prosecuted for life or sentenced to life for something that they didn't plan themselves, they didn't finance themselves, and when you think about the difference, it's just night and day. And I think that this is a space that should be pursued legally, and I really applaud this, to think in these terms, to pursue this legally moving forward under the new administration, because we're bound to see more of this kind of example lived out before our eyes.
Okay. Now, we asked some students on campus here what they think influences Islamophobia and what they think terrorism is as well. So let's go ahead and check that out.
News have been set up a way for you to kind of like, the thing that is going to call the most attention, and that's going to call them more views, and that's going to get more money to them. But sometimes they kind of like move the information just to kind of like get people to be interested in what they're saying.
Most of what people think comes from the media, because a lot of people don't do a lot of research. They just go whatever comes off of TV, and mostly the media likes to catch everything that's extreme. They catch all the extremes, they catch all the bad. So when you see the TV, you see the extreme and the bad of those certain people. Therefore, you'll start to think that those certain people always act that way.
So going back to another question now, do you think the media dubs the name terrorism only when it is a foreign person, and then mental illness when it is a white person committing a crime?
I think both of those generalities are genuinely true. I mean, I'm old enough to know that when a crime was committed, if they didn't identify the criminal as being an African American, I knew he wasn't. Today, when they have an act of violence, if they don't mention that person that's perpetrated it is Muslim, I know he's not. And so, as Edina mentioned previously, it's code, and it's unfortunate because it becomes a driver for what the public hears, what the public perceives, and they pick up on that.
Okay. And then what are your thoughts on that?
The media gives us ways of thinking about things, and as one of the students mentioned on the tape that you shared, when we only get one piece of the overall picture, and when that picture is exclusively through the lens of bad news, then we have a fundamental misunderstanding who a group of people are. And Muslims certainly aren't alone when it comes to these kinds of false characterizations or stereotypes, right? I mean, African Americans, Latinos, LGBTQ, I mean, women, the lists are long. We can often be misunderstood. But when it comes to terrorism and the lives that we've been living for the past 15 years, you throw the word terrorism into a conversation, and it's like throwing a fear bomb. I mean, it is a word, is a concept, and a phenomena that paralyzes people, or infuriates them, or both, right? Or makes them feel fearful. And so we're not having productive conversations around these things. And unfortunately, a lot of the media coverage, especially when we're still waiting to see who the perpetrator is in some of these situations, they start to make some assumptions and go fast and loose. And talking about things like radicalization. I mean, terrorism is one of those terms. Radicalization or homegrown terrorism, these are other terms that, again, are code or shorthand for talking about the exact same populations. But what we know, on the other hand, from the data from the FBI and others, is that I believe it's around 5% of all domestic acts of terrorism since 9/11 have been perpetrated by a Muslim or somebody who claims to be a Muslim. That means that 95% of all domestic terror plots that we have faced as a country are coming from other communities. When we fixate on one group of people thinking that we're going to solve the whole problem, we're missing 95% of the problem. And when it's young white men, or frankly any kind of white men, it easily gets labeled as being about mental illness, which I think all situations where an individual would take another human life for any purpose involves mental illness. But when we apply certain words and certain motivations is really what is suspect, and is really valuable about this conversation.
Yeah, so then why do you think there is that huge assumption that people have, not even the media, but people think if they saw like the San Bernardino shooter, that was automatically terrorism, but Adam Lanza from Sandy Hook was not an act of terrorism in some people's eyes? Why do you think people have that assumption, though?
Well, as Edina mentioned, you know, the media drives it to a certain extent. I mean, they're very cautious about applying the terrorist label in certain instances. They're getting a little bit more cautious now over the last 6 months, I've noticed that. But to her comment about the statistics, I mean, even closer, last year, we had 52 acts of what were deemed domestic terrorism in the United States where people were killed. 75% of those 52 people killed were killed equally by Muslim extremists on one end, white supremacists on the other. And yet our government's efforts in some of the programs we have are dedicated 95% or more toward Muslims and toward that ideology. And so it's interesting if you look at that. We're also now studying the number of police officers being killed by extremists, which unfortunately is increasing. And if you look at the number of shootings that police officers have had since 2009, 83% of the shootings police officers have had, if they have an extremist engaged with them, 83% are white supremacists. Those are statistics you don't hear. So there's this assumption that as we lay things out on the news each night, when you hear terrorism, automatically the default is somebody who happens to be Muslim. And it's unfortunate that that's happening because it's making it very difficult as the Department of Homeland Security is trying to roll out see something, say something. They need to see something and say something about all people and all things, and it's not being done equitably.
Yeah. So then, so knowing Trump's common plan on banning all Muslims, most of the people who committed these active terrorists within the past year and a half, they might have been from Muslim descent, but they were permanent residents of the U.S. They became citizens, and some were even born here. So how would banning all Muslims, would that help even the problem?
Frankly, I don't think that there's any way that that President-elect Trump can ban Muslims. I think that this is political rhetoric. I think even he knows that it's unconstitutional, but that this was used again as bait during the campaign season to stir people up. What is possible, however, though, is just as damaging, which is a reincarnation of a decade-old program that was called the NSEERS program, the National Security Entry Exit Registration System, if I remember it correctly. And this was a program, I think, created in 2003 or so when men from 19 different countries, all but 2 of them being Muslim-majority countries, had to go register at what was then Immigration and Naturalization Services, what's today sort of ICE and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they were between the ages of 18, I think, and 45 or something. So this was another kind of Muslim profiling, you might say, because what it was targeting was Arab men between the ages of 18 and 40, 45, and anybody who was coming in and out of the country. People got deported this way. People got detained this way. People got coerced into becoming undercover informants in exchange for immigration. There were all kinds of abuses that happened. In the end, how many terrorists did that program catch? 0. Not a single prosecution, not a single even arrest, not a single set of charges against any of those individuals. And so this program that cost millions and millions of dollars and really infringed on people's individual rights did nothing to actually make us safer. But it was a program that allowed the president and federal law enforcement to tell the public, look, we're safer because we're paying attention to this group of people. And it gives us a false sense of security, which is exactly what would be so dangerous if we proceeded this way in the coming year.
So then, your background in law enforcement, what do you think is the best approach for the government to handle this?
Well, the best approach is certainly what we all call community engagement, but real community engagement. You know, communities have to own and direct and drive and sustain efforts that are going to take place so that this doesn't happen. Communities also have to be in a position where they're not being marginalized. You know, there was a program in the UK many years ago, 2003, called Prevent. And they decided the at-risk community was the Muslim community. Well, by going to them with a program, it was at the exclusion of all others, not realizing that some of those Muslims were being victimized by other extremists. And so that's part of the problem. You know, and to Edina's comment about refugees, I mean, the majority of refugees that have come into the United States since 9/11 have been Christian. Last year, there was 46% of the people who came into the country as refugees were Muslim, 44% were Christian. And so if we're looking at numbers, and I know we have a concern about the foreign fighter threat, and I study that area quite extensively, and I can tell you that when you look at the events here that have even involved Muslims in acts of terrorism, Nadal Hassan at Fort Hood, Tamerlan Tsarnaev and Jahar Tsarnaev in Boston, and others, even the couple in San Bernardino, they were not trained, nor did they have battle experience, nor were they under command and control of some foreign entity. There's no foreign fighters that have ever attacked this country. So the refugee concern, to me, is farly overrated. And I can tell you, having dealt with and working very closely with the communities here in the United States who spend years in refugee camps before as they're being vetted to come here, it's a very exhaustive process. The vetting is very, very intense. It is very complete. I get concerned when someone says they're going to invoke extreme vetting, because I don't know what that means. It's a very rigorous process. And so to your question, I can just say that you know, these are things that unfortunately invoke fear in those communities. The community has to own it. And the problem we have in the United States with some of our government programs, we want to do surgery before we do the physical exam. And we walk into a community and say, hi, we're worried about your young people buying tickets to Syria. Well, you know, my biggest concern might be gang violence, or it might be truancy, or it might be that we don't have street lights. It's not my son or daughter buying a ticket to Turkey. And so that's part of the problem. We go in with these preconceived notions of what their challenges are without listening, and we need to become better listeners if we're going to have effective programs and strategies to combat this risk.
That is good, yeah. And then piggybacking off of what you said earlier, that they had no training, a lot of these attacks were done by lone wolves. I mean, that's what they're called. I mean, so they have no formal training, they never even went overseas, or some maybe were born overseas but were citizens here now. So why is there such a huge increase in lone wolf terrorism?
Well, one thing I do want to dispel is the myth that online radicalization is as pervasive as some people think. You know, people are not going into their bedroom, sitting at a keyboard, and then going down the street to learn how to build a bomb. That's not what's happening. The unfortunate thing is, regardless of the ideology, whether it be driven by race, religion, or some issue orientation, these individuals are, in most cases, being counseled, communicating with peers in their own neighborhoods. And it's not exclusive to Islam. You know, so that's a huge problem that we have to come to grips with in America, is that we have a lot of peer-to-peer coaxing and counseling that's going on here. The second piece to that is there is online information, and you can get it. But, you know, people can act out in any way that they want. Dylan Roof acted out because he believed that people weren't doing enough. He singled out the Klan and said, you know, you're not taking care of business, so someone has to do it, and felt like he was actually becoming a martyr for his race with regards to what he was doing. So there's this sense of altruism when a lot of people engage that way, that they're doing something good for their family, for their community, for their race.
And then those online sites, a lot of people have used them to learn more about terrorism and become more radicalized. Do you think the government can put a stop to those websites?
Well, we do have the technical capacity. I'll just say this, that I sat in a trial last spring of 4 young men in Minneapolis, and I got a lesson in encrypted apps and how they're used and how they know that what law enforcement can and can't do. So each time there's a countermeasure, there's a strategy to become adaptive. And so, you know, we do have rights in the country. We do have civil liberties and privacy. And, you know, in France, they are serving warrants without a judge's approval. They are going into phones without a search warrant and encrypted apps. I don't know that we're there yet, and I would never suggest anything that would make us unsafe, but I don't know that we're there yet, and I don't know that the American public would tolerate that.
Okay. Now, so going back, I know you were in the FBI, and a lot of these people were under inspection from the FBI. I know the Pulse nightclub shooter was under FBI radar, the Boston bombers were under radar, but then the FBI kind of dropped those cases or stopped looking into it. Can you kind of explain a little bit more about what happened there?
Yeah, absolutely. There becomes a point where we work off of what we call actionable intelligence. Mm-hmm. And so when there's no more actionable intelligence, when there is no more activity to suggest that this person might engage, is a threat, requires, I mean, in order to surveil one individual, it takes sometimes between 10 and 20 people. So if you look at the number of people that we have open cases on, and the number of people required to conduct physical surveillance, it's almost impossible. And so they prioritize these cases based on activity. Those individuals no longer had activity that suggested they might engage, and that's why they were no longer being actively investigated.
Okay. Edina, going back to you now, this question. So I know your organization kind of had a lot of hate crime. There was a lot of letters to your organization. How have you guys handled that?
Well, you know, here's the thing. We are certainly not alone, not in the good, not in the bad, right? So the Islamic Center of Southern California in Koreatown here in Los Angeles, in the span of the last month, received repeated death threats from, or staff member received repeated death threats from a Los Angeles resident who lives in Agora Hills. And when that person was arrested for making these death threats and a search warrant was served on his home, they found more than a dozen guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. This was a person who was clearly capable of making good on what he threatened. This was also a person who was let out on bail, and that the Islamic Center of Southern California had to take a restraining order out against in order to protect the community. In the wake of that, we also received an outpouring of love, anonymous donations from people in the community who came forward to say, we value you as our Muslim neighbors, and we want to contribute to the security of the mosque and the well-being of your community. That happened about a month ago. In the span of the last week or so, the Islamic Center was one of 5 or 6 mosques in the Southern California region to receive the same hate-filled letter that was also full of death threats and awful religious epithets. And in that case, that individual, you know, nobody, it's an anonymous individual, and law enforcement is doing everything it can. These are 2 incidents involving one mosque. They are just a drop in the bucket of incidents that are going on all over the country. We pay a lot of attention to the high-profile hate crimes cases where there's actual physical violence perpetrated against people, and there's an alarming rate of that going on. The Southern Poverty Law Center has said that there have been 800 incidents of hate crimes and hate incidents just since Election Day. That's a month ago. So we're in a really volatile season. But it's a mistake to just pay attention to the high-profile cases, because there's a lot of underreporting taking place, and there's a lot smaller incidents, you might say, that we now might call microaggressions, that are very real and have an impact on average, everyday people. Last year, a group called the Council on American Islamic Relations here in California did a study of Muslim students in public schools, and they found that half of those students reported getting bullied in the last year. Of those who said that they got bullied, which was, you know, harassment of one form or another, of those who said they got bullied, 1 in 5 of them said it happened from a teacher or administrator. So when we think about who's really vulnerable in our communities, a lot of this microaggression that has really damaging impacts on people's identity and sense of well-being is happening with our young people, and happening on campuses where people need better resources to be able to help facilitate healthy relations.
Yeah, I think a lot of those incidents are really not reported in the media or not spoken about. So a lot of people don't even know this is happening. I mean, it's a shame.
I think it goes both ways. I mean, frankly, I think that the hate crimes are underreported. And I think that there's also an underreporting of the acts of love. The reason I think this is important is because when the only story, you know, going back to media images, when the only stories that people hear about Muslims have to do with us as either perpetrators or as victims, what other options are there for how you can understand who we are? And I think that sort of models two ways of engaging Muslims, right? Now, how powerful would it be to model for the public a way of engaging Muslims that says that we stand together in solidarity and that people are doing this, not just in the interfaith communities, but, you know, random citizens in our city, and that Mayor Garcetti came to the Islamic Center of Southern California and spoke to the community to say, we stand with you, and this is a city where us is all of us, not any one of us. Those messages are really powerful and need to get out to Angelenos and to Americans in times like this when we feel uncertain, because when we feel uncertain is when we feel fear. When we feel fear, our brains turn off and our hearts turn on, and we don't always make the best decisions in those circumstances.
Yeah, okay, so my last question, we'll start off with you. What do you think drives people to feel hate towards a certain culture or religion or gender even?
I think that there are a lot of reasons. Most of them I trace back to a lack of exposure. I know that in my family, I mostly grew up around other European immigrants, mostly Caucasian, and it was only when I'm Asian, Mormon, Jewish, right? That was the extent of my exposure probably through high school. Then I went to UCLA and I met people of all different backgrounds, Jewish, African-American, Latino, so many different places, so many different faiths, and it changed my whole understanding of the world. Today, 62% of Americans say that they don't know a Muslim firsthand. That's something that we can break through, because it's critical that I know that if you know me, you will love me, because I'm a regular person, just the same way that everybody else is. But if you know a human being, it changes fundamentally how you think about a category of people, because you have to think about an individual person. And if you know more than one person from that group, it starts to really show you, oh, there is diversity, not because somebody told you, but because you see it and you experience it yourself. So I urge people, if you're afraid, if you're feeling nervous, if you don't know a Muslim, now's the time to reach out and say, I want to know you, let's talk.
And what are your thoughts?
Well, Dina's right. She's definitely hit the nail on the head. The only thing I would add to that is to say it's a learned behavior. I work with a lot of formers. I have friends who are former neo-Nazis, former skinheads, former jihadists, and they all say the same thing. They learned it. It wasn't something that was genetic. It wasn't something that just came to them. They were around people and situations where it was fostered. And from the individuals I know that have come out of that life, what they're trying to do is catch people along this radicalization pathway before they learn and start to engage in some of those extremist beliefs and some extremist thoughts. But it's based in one real concept, one of intolerance. And intolerance for another person's race, religion, political motivations, intolerance. And that's what drives all of these people who then go on to hate and go on to, unfortunately, in some instances, to terrorist behaviors.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for today, you guys. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This year, patriotism shouldn't just be about pride of country. It should be about love. Remember that to love America is to love all Americans, because love has no labels.
Hamilton was adopted from a rescue in 2008. He knows he's a pretty big deal. How could you not love him?
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media by searching CSUN On Point. You can listen to us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on LA 36 at 11:30, also on Sunday mornings. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Scott Sanders.